Welcome to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm Jenny Wilson, a trustee of NFRPP. In keeping with our mission to bring timely, fact-based programs to educate, inform, and foster civic engagement, tonight, for the fifth time, we return to the conversation on the war in Ukraine. Our program will be moderated by our dear friend Gideon Rose. And returning for this important conversation are our experts and special guests, Timothy Frye and Oksana Shevel. Oksana Shevel is an associate professor of political science at Tufts University and director of the Tufts International Relations Program. She is co-author with Maria Popova of a book that studies the root causes of the Russo-Ukrainian War, Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States. Her earlier book, Migration, Refugee Policy, and State Building in Post-Communist Europe, won the American Association Ukrainian Studies Prize for Best Book in the field of Ukrainian history, politics, language, literature, and culture. Professor Shevel serves as Vice President of the Association for the Study of Nationalities. She is also a country expert in Ukraine for the EU Global Citizenship Observatory. She is a board member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society and an associate of both the Davis Center and the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Professor Shevel holds a Ph.D. in government from Harvard, a master's in philosophy in international relations from the University of Cambridge, and a B.A. in English and French from Kyiv State University. Timothy Frye is the Marshall D. Shulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy. He received a B.A. in Russian Language and Literature from Middlebury College, an M.I.A. from Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, and a Ph.D. in Political Science from Columbia. His research and teaching interests are in comparative politics and political economy, focusing on the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. His most recent book is Weak Strongman, The Limits of Power in Putin's Russia. He also edits Post-Soviet Affairs. Tonight's moderator, Gideon Rose, is the Mary and David Boies Distinguished Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was previously editor of Foreign Affairs from 2010 to 2021. He served as Associate Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council from 1994 to 1995 during the Clinton administration. His most recent articles in Foreign Affairs are Why the Ukraine Won't Go Nuclear and The Irony of Ukraine. At NFRPP, we believe that exploring complex issues is at the root of finding solutions, making meaningful change, fostering understanding, and finding common ground. If you agree with our mission, please consider supporting our work. Please visit our website, nfrpp.org, to learn more. We are proud that our audience represents all sides of the political spectrum, which always results in a lively Q&A. Please type your questions into the Q&A box, and we will respond to as many as time allows. In the next few days, this program will be available as a video on our website to share with your friends, your social media, or in your classroom. Please sign up for our newsletter to learn more about upcoming programs. As a final note, we want to hear your thoughts on the programs that you would like to see in the coming months. Please use the audience survey or drop us an email at info@nfrpp.org with your ideas. Gideon, Oksana, and Timothy, thank you so much for being with us again tonight. Let's get started.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And it's great to be back here with all of you in the audience and with Tim and Oksana. I'm teaching a course this fall, Columbia Intro IR, and all these students, they look up to me as if I have answers to give them. They see a world spinning into chaos. They see things. And I try to tell them I don't know the answers and don't have the answers, and they don't believe me because they desperately hope that somebody can make sense for them of the chaos that they are witnessing. And I was thinking about that, and then I realized, you know what? I feel the same way. And so I come to people like Oksana and Tim, desperately hoping that they can give me the answers that will allow me to sort of get through the day, thinking that the world is not spinning off. We've spent several of these sessions talking about dramatic changes in the war and then talking about dramatic lack of changes in the war. We're now back to talking about dramatic impending changes in the war, but this time coming not from Eurasia, but from the US. Because with Trump's election and with the cabinet that he is picking on the basis of today's things, there's no doubt that US policy toward the conflict in Ukraine will change somewhat dramatically. We don't know exactly how, we don't know exactly the degree, we kind of know the direction, but the details are yet to be worked out. But what we can say is it would be shocking at this point if anything resembling current policy continued dramatically, I think. And so to help us figure out what's going to happen, no better people to talk to than Tim and Oksana for a variety of reasons, because their expertise in the warring belligerents is obviously the chief draw, but they also now, both of them have expertise in political systems that seem a little more like the one we're going into here. And maybe that will be more insightful, because those of us who have studied American foreign policy and American politics find ourselves completely, frankly, at a loss. And so it'll be interesting to see whether they can do a little bit better. So first, guys, put the election aside for a sec. Give us an update on where the war is now, absent the US. We'll get to the question of what the US is going to do and how that will affect where the war goes from here. But assuming that the election was next month rather than this month, and you had to give an update since the last meeting, what is the status of the war on the ground? Oksana, you want to go first? Unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. And on your point, Gideon, that students look to us for answers. They think we know things, but we look to other people for answers. I'm sort of in the same boat with you here, but I'll do my best to share what I think I may speak to.
I literally asked my old professors to do a session at the council or roundtable, Dick Betts and Mike Mandelbaum, because I was like, okay, I'm going to turn to my teachers. Maybe they know what's going to happen next.
Right. Well, probably nobody knows, but let's do our best based on what we do know. So, and the question you're asking about kind of the state of field, what has happened in the last several months since the time we met last. So that's in a way easier because we are kind of looking back instead of looking forward. So let me just start by saying very briefly that, from the Ukrainian perspective, looking at the war, where things stand, the last several months were certainly not a great time. Russia continued its grinding offensive in the east, and that offensive accelerated in recent months, especially after strategic town of Avdiivka fell last February, this town in Donbass. And Russia has been gaining gradually, but still gaining territory since then. And in fact, this territorial gain accelerated somewhat this summer, and there are a variety of causes for it. One was certainly delay in the approval of US military aid that was delayed by more than 6 months before finally being passed in April. That really put Ukraine in a bad position. And even after the aid was delivered, I was just looking at Ukrainian news yesterday. I think it was Zelensky himself or one of senior officials said something less than like 70% of the promised aid was actually delivered so far, even few if we look at air defenses. Permission, of course, to use long-range weapons to strike targets deeper in Russia remains to be denied. Too much frustration on the part of Ukraine because they're basically being pounded by these glide bombs, the bombings of Ukrainian cities. The infrastructure, just yesterday, a mother with 3 young children was killed in her apartment building the devastated father is all over the news, but that's a daily occurrence in Ukraine. So this result leads to pretty bitter mood and profound sense of kind of unfairness that Ukraine has been forced to fight with one hand behind its back. But at the same time, there are also problems domestic to Ukraine. So the weapons shortage is certainly an important factor, but Ukraine also had its own problems with mobilization and troop training, replenishment of the front line. So that's, additional complications. So both sort of the manpower shortage and the weapons shortage allowed Russia to gain some territory in the east. But I would also say that these territorial gains, even though they've been somewhat substantial, I'll just give a few numbers in a second. I think it's important to also put them in the perspective. So on the one hand, yes, Russia gained more land in particular last month, just October alone, since any point since 2022. But that's still, if you look at kind of the map from bird's eye view, it is still pretty small, relatively speaking, gain. And more importantly, or maybe equally importantly, Ukraine actually had this pretty daring offensive in the Kursk region and gained some Russian territory, which we don't really hear that much about. But I think it is a factor. We can certainly talk more about it. I mean, it is and remains a gamble, but basically the territory Ukraine sees there is actually more than the territory Russia sees in Ukraine. So that's sort of militarily, I would say, where things stand, and maybe I'll pause here and let Tim add to it.
Okay, let me actually just summarize. I'm curious to get it sounded the way you portrayed things. Again, absent the American question and side of things, just on the ground, as if this had been sort of like a tug of war back and forth, and then now like it's moved a little bit more over into the Ukrainian side as like Russia is, or Russia is pulling a little bit ahead, but it's still kind of a slog. We're not on the verge of a rout, are we? There's not on the verge of a military turning point.
Yeah, I think this is sort of a bit of an unknown here, right? Because so far, like, yes, Ukraine has lost some territory there, but there hasn't been like collapse of the front and sort of this type of rapid advance that, say, Ukraine had in the fall of 2002 against Russia. So that hasn't happened. Could it happen? I mean, again, I'm not a military expert myself. Like, it seems military experts are sort of cautious. They're not saying it's imminent. They're not excluding it, right? And additional, I think, part of this equation is, can Russia really sustain the space? Because yes, they've been gaining territory, but their losses have been staggering too. I think in October alone, this is the month when they gained the most land. They've been losing like 1,500 people a day. Right, the economy is not doing all that great, and again, sort of, if indeed there is no collapse of Ukrainian front and some sort of rapid breakthrough, if they are advancing at this kind of pace, I mean, we can mention the strategic town of Pokrovsk in Donbass, which seems like in August was on the verge of being captured by Russia. It still hasn't been captured. Russia had this incursion in northern Ukraine near Kharkiv that Ukrainians were able to beat back. So I think to your question, the answer is we don't really know. I think it's possible. But it seems like, at least as of now, my understanding is that there isn't like an imminent sign of imminent collapse of Ukrainian front.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, so Tim, let me turn to you on this exact point. It seems there were points, it was always, there's a question of the fighting capabilities of each side and the will to fight. And the early on, the worries were who would break first in some sense. And Ukraine didn't break. Europe didn't break. Russia hasn't broken, and now it looks like the US might be breaking a little bit. But the big question here is, given what Oksana said about the phenomenal costs of the war, the obvious devastating effects, why has Russian will manage to stay so strong and Putin's position internally get even stronger rather than weaker over time?
It's important to remember that the projection of strength is not the same thing as strength. And Putin has long been conscious of his own image, take the shirt off, flex the muscles in a Photoshop, inject a little Botox here and there. So, but at the same time, certainly Russia has held up much better than many expected. The sanctions have had, a big impact and make life very difficult in Russia. But, Russia's a big economy. It's largely a market economy, and that's helped it to find ways around the sanctions. oil prices and oil revenue has still been flowing into the Russian state. And what it's allowed them to do is to replenish their troops without having to do a general or even a partial mobilization, as we saw in September of 2022, when Russia tried to call up young Russian men into the army. 700,000 Russians left the country. So to avoid doing that, the Russian government has enough revenue to keep buying a mercenary army composed of its own citizens.
So wait, the oil revenues are going towards propping up the economy and purchasing a mercenary army from the provinces.
Exactly.
Which is then fed into the maw of battle in the front.
From the most marginal parts of Russian society, the ones that have even less voice than the Russian middle class or the Russian oligarch class. They're the ones that are bearing the great costs of the war. And Oksana is absolutely right. 1,200, 1,500 casualties a day, well over 1,000 war dead. In Afghanistan, Russia had 15,000 killed in action. They've got 6 or 7 times that at a minimum right now for, a sliver of territory in eastern Ukraine that they took early on and have been defending and now gradually expanding. But Russia feels like it's on the front foot. It's been able to bring 10,000 North Korean troops into the battle. They're not very experienced. I imagine that communication with the Russians is not easy. They're not battle hardened. They haven't faced the kind of advanced technology in warfare that Ukraine will put before them. But do the math. If that's 10,000 North Koreans at 1,500 killed a day, that buys that much more time. With it could very easily be another 50,000 or 100,000 North Koreans. And I don't think Seoul or Moscow is really going to sweat too much those kinds of losses, particularly given that the Kremlin feels like that the correlation of forces in old Soviet language or in Russian foreign policy terms, they see as in their favor. So they're willing to accept these kinds of high casualty rates.
Okay, so imagine again that the US election was, let's say, a year from now. And we were doing this like all the other previous sessions. We were doing this within the Biden administration, same team, same administration, no immediate election, but one down the road. What would the proper US strategy be towards the situation you guys just described? In other words, if the election wasn't until 2025, hadn't happened, Biden administration is still managing US policy as it wishes, what should it do with regard to this war that's trending Russia's way at high cost, but without being decisively over yet? What would the right policy have been if the Biden administration tasked you guys with a rethink? Would you say, keep doing what you're doing? Would you say, step up your efforts? Or would you say, you know what, this is now trapped in a hurting stalemate. Let's just call it a day and try to move forward and open negotiations? What would you have recommended doing?
I mean, the last strategy is the one I would have avoided the most, particularly because we have experience with Minsk I and Minsk II with peace agreements that are dictated to Ukraine. And we saw how those worked out. And I don't have any reason to expect a different outcome if the United States were to decide that it was in their interests to compel or do what they could to try to get Ukraine to agree to a peace deal in hopes that the problem would go away, because it wouldn't. At this point, why would Putin make a deal? I mean, in the American commentariat keeps saying, "Oh, just we're the U.S. is just going to go in and make a deal." First of all, it's not clear that Zelensky, what the terms that Ukraine will accept. But certainly from the Russian point of view, why not? Why would you make an agreement now when things are looking in your favor? You know that the U.S. is not going to give Ukraine the ability to strike deep into your own territory. So I would have been much more willing to allow Ukraine to strike military targets within Russia as a way to try to compel Russia to the negotiating table.
Okay,
But if you want
Oksana,
an
what would
agreement,
your
both sides
Yeah,
have to have something to lose. So
I think Tim and I would have given similar advice. Nobody asked us, but I think I would say the same thing that
okay?
yeah.
this inability, this sort of escalation management, whatever the term is, has been such a cause of not just frustration for Ukraine, but you can see the results that did not really lead to any de-escalation from Russia. And this notion that it's going to cross some sort of Putin's red line, I think it may have been a valid concern at the beginning of the war, but so many so-called red lines have been crossed, right? So this notion that if Ukraine is able to strike like airports, facilities, military facilities, nobody's saying striking Kremlin, right? It is really striking military, especially the various airfields and like weapons depot that Ukrainians have been asking for. And in a way, it's not too late for Biden administration to do it now. They still have time in the White House before, the new team comes in. And as you said, who knows what they will do. So I think that would be one recommendation I would make. And again, echoing something that Tim is saying, I think this notion that Putin just wants, some sort of deal and maybe the so-called Russian-speaking territory and like, let's not have Ukraine in NATO. And that's all he wants. I think that's just a delusion. I mean, he really is in it. I mean, we can talk more about it, but I think it should be clear to all by now that he is in it to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign state, be it by through conquest, be it through some puppet government, which no democratic process can produce in Ukraine, I don't think. But I mean, that would be acceptable to him too, right?
Mhm.
And
Okay,
then
so
sort
this is
of this
now getting
notion.
really interesting. Next immediate question on this: what will the Trump administration try to do? Not what it will get, but what will it try to do?
My sense is that Trump initially will try to bargain hard with Putin, and he'll say, "We can flood Ukraine with weapons if you don't pull back." And he'll be a lot. There'll be a lot of bluster, a lot of kind of theatrics to try to make it look as if he is bargaining hard and getting a good deal. I think he'll lose patience quickly, and Putin will wait him out, and he'll try to, compel Ukraine to have some agreement. And we can talk about what the contours of that agreement might look like. For a long time it was thought Russia keeps the land, Ukraine gets in NATO, or Ukraine gets armed to the teeth so that this doesn't happen again. But if some of the talk out of the Trump camp suggests that even that won't be enough. Like a ban on Ukraine joining NATO for 10 years or 20 years, or some kind of demilitarization, or some kind of veto of Russia over, the kind of government that Ukraine has. Those kinds of things would just be a disaster. And
Do you
I'm
think
worried
there's
that
any
that's where we're
realistic
headed.
chance of that? Do you think there's any realistic chance of the United States trying to get push for that?
I don't think the last part, but certainly the notion that Ukraine commits to neutrality and Russia gets to keep the land. I think there are people in Trump world for whom that would be a reasonable outcome. I mean, J.D. Vance has said, that's a reasonable outcome, and then we can focus on China, as if the problem is just going to go away because they've reached an agreement. And that just seems to me to be fantasy.
Okay. Oksana, what's your take on what they'll try to do?
I would preface it by saying that I have no idea what Trump
Yeah.
would do. I think this is one of the sort of the kind of differences in the moment that we could maybe reasonably speculate that, you know, this administration is likely to do this and that. I think with Trump, the uncertainty, at least to my mind, is so much greater. And one question that I am sort of, I mean, like I would say it's a big question mark for me, and I already had some disagreements with colleagues, and I will fully admit maybe my take is overly optimistic here. But I think there may be limits as to what Trump would accept because he wants to present it as a good deal that he achieved as opposed to he gave Putin everything he wants. So if that's indeed the case, then there could be some sort of potential silver lining there because Putin is going to demand so much. Like if they think that he would just agree to, you know, some sort of like freeze the current line. I mean, he already said he wants much more. Like he would made it very clear. They want all the territory because it's now in the Russian constitution, all 4 regions that they don't control. They want the army like sliced to nothing. They want to have veto on Ukrainian security guarantees in addition to no membership in NATO. Right, the so-called denazification, which they never abandoned, which basically means you have a compliant government in Kyiv that cannot do anything from like renaming streets to doing some regional reform, right? So again, as Tim is saying, so once it gets into this negotiation process and it becomes clear to the Trump team that what Putin wants is not what they think he wants. And then the question to my mind becomes, would they still just give it all to him, kind of, or at least try? Again, I think what Ukrainians will not agree to will be a big sort of part of it. Or would they say, well, you know what, like, that's not reasonable, that's not a good deal, like, and then we're sort of again in this kind of prolonged potential negotiation as opposed to solving it all in 24 hours. So I think that's another kind of way
Okay, so
to
this
think
is
about
good.
it.
Now we have two. Okay, I'm in agreement with you guys so far, and I want to spell out these different paths. Okay, so Trump comes in, he puts forward an initial goal that is a deal which is far more pro-Russia than any of us would want, but nevertheless is sort of like the minimum possible acceptable in terms of loss of territory, but real guarantees, independence, and the rest of Ukraine gets to join the West in some significant way. Russia looks at that deal, calls the U.S. bluff, and says, nice, but I want the whole shebang that essentially is not just the immediate land, but substantial control over the rest of the land that I don't have in some significant way, whatever either, you know, you don't get neutrality or no security provisions or whatever, something that essentially enables him in practice to Finlandize the rest of Ukraine, not just the land that he has. At that point, the ball goes back into the Trump administration's court, and it can go two ways. There are people who would accept that deal and fully sell out Ukraine. We don't know whether they will be empowered, but let's say for a second, option one or path one is those people say, okay, if that's the deal we have to take to get out of this thing, we'll take it. Screw you, Ukraine. And they walk away. That history goes one path like that. The other path is the one you guys have laid out, which is they say, wait a second, when Putin calls the bluff, demands a much bigger deal, one that no reasonable person could say was anything other than a capitulation, a complete new appeasement or whatever. And the administration says Trump's ego or pride or desire for public acclaim or whatever leads him to say, no, there is some shit I will not eat, as the E. Cummings poem said, and in effect flips and either keeps Ukraine in the fight or pushes back. What happens in that second scenario? In other words, if Trump does that, and after having Putin holding out for more, where does the war go from there?
Well, I would just, you know, to start, maybe I'll just mention, I think it actually was a question in the comment, that first of all, you know, the weapon that's coming into Ukraine now, the participant is saying, I mean, that's probably some fact that they may have enough until like summer of 25, right? Ukraine will not agree. I mean, I think Zelensky already signaled, and he signaled it before. If there is some sort of substantive security guarantee outside of NATO, he would consider it. I think Ukrainian society, right? But it can't be another Budapest memorandum, security assurances, Minsk III. And we don't really know, at least I certainly can think, like, what is it short of NATO, right? Like, what is it like what kind of security guarantee would it be? Troops on the ground, you know, that's supposedly escalation. So what I'm saying that if Ukraine, so it's not just what Trump would do. Like if Ukraine would not accept like clearly like a terrible deal that would end its sovereignty, then it still has some time, right? Like this 24-hour fantasy, like let's just forget about it. That also gives time, and again, it was also in the part of the question, for the Europeans to get involved, right? For the, you know, South Korea might be another factor given that North Korea is in the picture, right? And then if we sort of think of Trump administration several months from now, we don't know what kind of disarray they're going to get themselves in on all sorts of domestic issues, right? So this sort of, like, I think the uncertain, basically, well, I guess what I'm trying to say that there may be a little bit of time for other options or other parties to kick in support of Ukraine. And, you know, in the Trump administration, to sort of, you know, as opposed to everybody does what Trump wants, camps forming, people having different positions, disagreement, right? And then we are kind of like where we are now, maybe in another 6 months, as opposed to some.
I was thinking of opening this session by saying each one of these sessions, I've been depressed when our panelists concluded that we'll be in the same rough place 6 months from now. And this time, if they would say that, I would be so happy. So, okay, I'm glad you said that. I really was, that was the most optimistic scenario. By the way,
Yeah.
Oksana, I agreed with that. I've even written that. But like both of you, I guess, my take and my mood changes each week to week. So when I'm in my optimistic modes, I make the very case you guys are making for why the flip could happen and how it can keep going. And in my pessimistic moments, I get all nervous.
I think that's exactly right. And you know, the issue is long split the Republicans. One of the few issues where there has been a big split among Republicans. It's also an issue where there's still considerable public support. You know, I did some public opinion polling last year on support for Ukraine in the US, and it's been relatively consistent for a long time. It's a very popular issue among Democrats. It's a relatively popular position among independents. And among Republicans, it's about 40 opposed, 40 against, and 20% don't know, don't care. So for American politics, that's what passes for a consensus issue, where, you know, most issues are, you know, 70-30 one way or another. So the Ukraine issue cuts a little differently than some of the other issues in American politics.
Tim has pointed out that, you know, the system effects, the homeostatic nature, that things don't always bandwagon and cascade. Sometimes an advance could push forward. By the way, that's one of the reasons why, if I were Europe, although I would help Ukraine, I don't think that a victory in Ukraine is a prelude to him attacking and taking over NATO and starting World War III, precisely because the victory in Ukraine would scare the crap out of Europe and turn it into, and make it, and the losses Russia has already suffered would make it not likely to engage in another ongoing military operations. But do you think that can still happen? I'm intrigued that you think that can still happen in the U.S. in the next few years on this issue. In effect, that there might be systems. And Oksana, do you really see Europe picking up the slack from the U.S.?
Well, I mean, I don't know even if it's even possible sort of technically and militarily, because Europe has been, many countries provide much more support to Ukraine as a share of their GDP than US has. But then if you look at statistics specifically for weapons, it seems US is disproportionately, you know, significant contributor. Could enough be done? You know, and by the so-called coalition of the willing, there is already discussion. I think the Polish, was it foreign minister, said he's meeting, or maybe he's already met with the Baltics, the Nordics, kind of like the more, you know, hawkish, we can say, realistic on Russia group of European countries, right? So in a way, I mean, Trump administration is, you know, even Ukraine aside, kind of specific, is broad problem for the transatlantic alliance if you're going to have, you know, parts, you know, in NATO sort of split in there, different groups, so forth. But to your question, what is like sort of realistic? I think, I mean, this is again, you know, maybe many will disagree with me in the audience and even you, Gideon, but I think it's a very short-sighted way to think about that, like, well, you know, nothing as bad is going to happen to NATO even if Ukraine falls. Like, certainly he's not going to march to Berlin tomorrow. But if you think about, right, that a country the size of Ukraine with population determined to be free was basically like rolled over by Russia, right? Like what kind of signal does it send, you know, to Putin? And yes, they're exhausted, but they would also press gang Ukrainians to serving in the army just like they did in the DNR, right? Like, so in a way, if you're talking about sort of, and then it's not going to happen in a year or two, but like what's them to prevent taking over Moldova, right? I mean, Moldova is not part of NATO. like who, the bolts, I mean, I think are not, at least some of them are like, well, who would stand up for us? Like, is Estonia with 1.5 million people strategically important for the US? You can imagine, substantial part of Trump team for sure saying maybe it's not that important, or if it's some sort of like hybrid thing. So I'm not saying it is imminent. I think that would be overstatement. But I think the kind of, Europe and world will be created if Ukraine were allowed to fall. I think everybody would be less secure and not more secure. And all of these debates, like, would they really go then further? Should we spend more money to the, military? Should we not spend more money to the military? You look at percent of people, I think there was a poll recently, who is prepared to fight for their country in Western countries. It's less than 30%, right? So this sort of like complacency maybe for the last 50 years or plus, since the Second World War. Again, I don't want to say like doomsday Putin is going to march to Berlin tomorrow, but I think the notion that sort of like, yes, too bad for Ukraine, we may have to throw them to the dogs, but everybody else is going to be okay. Like, I wouldn't be so optimistic, especially in the medium to long term. I think that would be completely different sort of world and global security, certainly European security we will be looking at.
I wasn't quite saying that, but in a sense, I was saying that I think that if Ukraine if Ukraine was sold out and Russia took it for precisely the reasons that you just said, that would scare the US and Europe out of their complacency and recreate a new Cold War, which their own security would ultimately be provided for because Russia wouldn't be able to attack them. But I hear what you're saying. Tim, will US leave NATO?
One point I wanted to make that is also very important is that what happens in Ukraine is also really important for Russia's future. And if Putin is allowed to claim a victory, his successor will undoubtedly come from the ranks of the Putin camp and will be somebody like him. Whereas if he's not allowed to claim a victory and people begin to ask questions, we lost how many people to gain how much territory of land that we didn't even want in the first place? We're the largest country in the world. How much land do we need? So, there's also a sense in which the outcome in Ukraine also has a big impact on a post-Putin Russia, or even Putin's Russia going forward. So a Russia where Putin can, claim that the whole world was against us and we won is a very different Russia than one that says, well, we stood up to the West, we did our best, and now we're dealing with the consequences. So I in a sense, look, the future of Europe is dependent in part on whether you have a Russia that is as hostile as the current Russia, or a Russia that is focused on its own problems at home. And a victory in Ukraine assures that I think there will be more problems for Europe in the future, and a Russia that we don't want. So,
it could actually have the opposite effect in Europe, though. It could actually bring about a new wave of unification in order to deal with the external threat.
Possible, yeah.
What?
It's possible. Yeah. It's possible.
Will the United States leave NATO?
I don't think so. I think there'll be lots of positioning. I think the Europeans will make enough changes so that Trump can say, I whipped them into shape. And I don't think they're going to leave NATO. I think that is a step too far.
Oksana, what would your bet be on the U.S.?
I want to hear what Gideon has to say on this question, because you're the IR scholar who was in the you're playing this role as if you're the neutral moderator without any background knowledge.
I'm trying to draft off you guys so that I can steal your insights and seem wise. You've been right about everything in this war more than me so far, and so now I want to I want to copy off the smart kids. Tests. Oksana, do you think there's
I also don't think that, with the caveat that I think we are all guessing sort of the range of possibilities in this administration is anyone's guess, but I also don't think it's very likely. But I do want to say a couple of words about NATO, because again, seeing questions pop up in the comments, like it seems like so many people are still holding on to this idea. If only, Putin is promised that Ukraine won't be in NATO, that would just, can we put the genie back in the bottle, somebody said. And I just want to emphasize that if we look at the history of Ukraine, NATO, NATO, Russia-NATO relations. It is just not about NATO. Ukraine had zero chance of entering NATO. Everybody knows it. Putin knew this. There was no support for Ukraine in it, like 25% at most. Yes, Bush Senior, lame duck, wanted Ukraine to be, Bush Junior, rather, right, like in 2008, to be in NATO. Other NATO members didn't want it. Ukraine was attacked when it was neutral, right? This whole notion that sort of to say that country in theory has a right to join NATO, that's just part of international system. Like countries have sovereignty and they can choose the alliances. So in a way to say like some country does not have this right, it's sort of, it violates the principle, but doesn't change anything in substance. So I can't imagine that, it sort of takes us back to the point we already discussed, that what Putin really wants exceeds that by a lot. Ukraine was already neutral. It had no chance of getting in. They already controlled Crimea. They already controlled Eastern Donbass. Ukraine had no chance of regaining this territory. Then they invaded in February 2002, lost hundreds of thousands of people. As Tim said, like, what have they accomplished exactly now? A little bit more of territory, which is all destroyed, by the way, right? And, the consequence for their society and so forth. So just to say that he would settle for this, plus the non-existing prospect, which was non-existing all along, of Ukraine's membership in NATO, just seems like it's just not about NATO. So I'll just say
I'm
that.
delighted to hear you say all this, not just because it's comforting, but because it's funny. I was trying to teach this to my students, and I was like, we've talked about structure and agency and choice, and and chance. And when the election sort of results came down, I said, okay, this wasn't chance. This wasn't the coin flipping on its, landing on its edge. This was a collective act of agency by the country, which will have consequences. The next step to notice is the agency that the administration will adopt, the incoming. Trump has agency. What will he choose to go for? Who will he choose to appoint? We're starting to see that now when we're talking about what he might want to do. I said, and then you start to see structures kick in. And I said, precisely because the intentions are so different, this will be a great test to see which structures act like a natural experiment. Anything that doesn't change, any policy that actually stays recognizably somewhat similar, is a clue to some structural force in the system operating to keep it that way, because these guys would want to change things. Let me turn one quick question before we get to the comments and all the stuff in there that we haven't covered. You two are both familiar with illiberal regimes and how academics have to live their life in those regimes. You are both professors at fancy American elite universities. Trump has made it clear that his administration will, in effect, do more, will try to deal with the elite academy in certain ways. People are talking about the potential use of federal funding as a cudgel, attempts to punish or change questions of speech on campus. Do you, as American academics, knowing how universities operate in other countries, worry at all that your academic lives and settings and environments will in any way be threatened by the new administration coming in?
So, yes.
Shit, I was hoping you would say no.
No, I am concerned. Look, every democratic backsliding country has targeted universities. I taught it in the most liberal institution in Russia for a decade, from 2011 till 2022. And within the span of 6 months, it was opening branches in the territories that Russia's occupying in Ukraine. It flipped that quickly. Orban in Hungary pushed out the Central European University. Modi in India, in Turkey, the great Turkish universities have really suffered. And, make no mistake, American universities, for all of their problems, are the envy of the world. I mean, the smartest students in the world want to study in the US. And anything that's done to damage the brand, I think it's just incredibly, incredibly short-sighted.
So what realistically are you worried about?
So taxes on endowments. We've already seen in red states a tax on anything related to diversity, equity, teaching of courses on race and gender. Um, so I do think that there are real threats. I think universities are great punching bags because we can't really hit back because we're supposed to be neutral, right? We're not supposed to be political, and this isn't really what we're designed to do. So one can imagine Congress, subpoenaing universities and damaging them, with donors, within the public eye, with the intent of weakening them as to the extent that we're a political force in the country. I think that is I think that's a possibility. I'm hopeful that it doesn't come to that. I think there's a distinction between state universities and private universities, where state universities are in a much more difficult situation. So yeah, I would like to say I'm more optimistic and it's just going to be business as usual. But we saw the congressional investigations last year, which I think did have a big impact on higher education. So,
Oksana, are you worried?
Yeah, well, if you want more optimistic take, I'm like, I agree with Tim that we shouldn't be complacent and think it's going to be business as usual, but I would emphasize sort of the distinction between private and public universities and blue versus red states, and the relative shortness of presidential term here, right? Because it takes time to destroy, a robust system as in US higher education institutions, right? So even if they try to do it, I think the first targets would be universities, state universities in red states, places like where Tim and I teach, private schools in blue states. I mean, Trump is going to be in office for how long? I mean, if we're sort of in the Orban territory or Putin territory, where this also autocratic consolidation did not happen overnight, like that was a progression, and things sort of got progressively worse and worse because these people were able not only to stay in power, but to consolidate the power and engage in more and more repressive actions. So again, depending what happens in the US political system, sort of broadly speaking, as a result of the Trump presidency, we may be in the Orban territory. I don't think we'll be like in the Hitler territory, but certainly in the Orban territory in some not too far future. And then, it would be much more pessimistic picture. But I would say for the first, 4 years, and just sort of by way of anecdote, because when I teach on the Scarlet Revolutions and the electoral fraud and the role of universities, because universities were pressured, for students, it's sort of hard to wrap their mind around. Like I show them this picture of the students being forced to vote, a certain way. They're like, but why? Like, who tells them to vote? And then I tell them sort of the way it worked. For example, in Ukraine in 2004, presidential administration would make calls to the regional governments. Regional governments would call the rectors, like the presidents of universities, who then would call heads of the departments, who then would tell their faculty, if your students do not vote, if this precinct where the dorm is attached does not vote, you're going to lose funding, students are going to get kicked out, they're going to lose their stipends. Like we are sort of far from that, thankfully yet. But as Tim is saying, I don't think we should be complacent, and sort of the Orban scenario in the US cannot be excluded, but I don't think it's going to happen in the next couple of years.
Okay, this is great, by the way. This is the best answer I've gotten to that question. I've been thinking the last few days, weeks about that. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's more. I mean, look, what makes the universities great is their reputations and how people perceive them. And, to the extent that you can do damage to that reputation and people's perception, it can have real harm on the the university. I think that
can happen faster. You're right. I mean, that can happen faster than
but Oksana is right.
So what are the things to look for? Name 2 steps towards urbanism that we should be watching if we're trying to score this at home? What are the steps that would make you say, okay, now we're heading significantly in that direction?
Well, one thing people, well, one way that actually, even before that, the way the government's funding priorities can have a big impact on universities as well. A lot of university revenue comes from federal grants, and a lot of those grants are tied to areas that are likely to see really big cuts during the Trump administration. So there could be like a direct financial impact. One area would be, continuing congressional investigations that are really designed to well, I won't go so far as to kind of, embarrass, but, continuing investigations that are done that could have a damaging effect. I think that would be one thing that might signal some kind of intent in what what the incoming administration is after. That would be one thing.
Oksana, what are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I would say sort of broadly speaking, not just university, but kind of Trump-like, non-democratic or whatever you want to call it, facade democracy or something. I think the judiciary is super important because if you look at this authoritarian kind of pathway towards authoritarianism, from the time these authoritarian leaders first took power in the countries like Hungary, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, under Yanukovych, assault on the independent judiciary. And creating compliant judiciary was one of the first critical steps. And that could be done various ways. It's from appointing, some judges that are in probational terms to rule on very important cases, to creating new institutionals and dismantling some of them.
They're putting
And
Matt
so
Gaetz
I
as
would
the
be,
Attorney General.
well, so I mean, I'm saying that I would be looking at that. And of course, US, had independent judiciary, unlike, with stronger history and all of this than places like, Hungary or Poland or Russia or Ukraine. But I don't think it's bulletproof, right? I mean, we've already seen the way kind of courts can be manipulated. And so I would really be paying attention to that. And related to this, also the media, because that's another sort of autocratic tool in the autocratic toolkit to have large audience media fall in line, be it through self-censorship or through outright pressure. Again, US has, much stronger tradition here with independent media, but of course we can also say people not really trusting mainstream media, this whole that there is deep state, what have you, and many people do buy that. But I would be looking at these two broader fields, the judiciary and the media.
Now you got me upset again. Okay. We have a bunch of questions we want to get to for the end. What effect will Tulsi Gabbard's appointment have? We have Tulsi Gabbard, a regular RT commentator and official friend of Russia, as the director of national intelligence. What will that mean? The person who gives the president his presidential daily brief and supervises the entire U.S. intelligence community.
Is it too much to hope that the intelligence community can push back against whatever nonsense she may want to do?
Oh, so
I mean, she's the one who talked about biolabs in Ukraine. I mean, I don't know. I have no expertise in U.S. national security field, but if you want more optimistic take, that's my hope, that given, she's has no expertise on this, she has been literally repeating Putin, talking points. And I think that's how she became known in this country. Who would have heard of her otherwise, right? Again, I don't know how the intelligence system works, how powerful or not one person can be. I mean, I would be concerned that she may sell some secrets to Russia or give them, right? But I really have no expertise in this field.
Kim, what do you think?
Well, I'd be interested. You have more experience working at high levels of the U.S. government than I do.
This is a clown car, not a cabinet. And we're so far beyond the bounds of previous extended practice. Put it this way, just as Trump, the candidate, was, unlike what we've seen before, even though there were some similarities. So these are not just sort of, Marco Rubio is a normal cabinet member, whether you like him or not, whether, you respect him or not, or agree with him or not, not out of the bounds. Hegseth, Gabbard, Gates, these are the kinds of people, if they ever were to get near a cabinet, who were stuck in the departments that didn't matter, as you essentially paid off members of your coalition with a cabinet appointment or created a diverse group that you wanted for whatever reason. They're now in charge of, these are the major, everything. So we haven't yet seen public health, and we haven't yet seen Treasury and the economic stuff. We don't know whether the rich people will get stability and competence, and it's just foreign policy and the legal system that gets sort of politicization. But we'll have to just see. And in terms of what will happen, I mean, everything that Oksana said about universities is true of government bureaucracies as well. They are very, very hard to kill. They last a long time. They can slow things down. But if we were to, and the things that I'm worried about, and in steps toward Orbanism category, shall we say, there was an article in the journal today, Wall Street Journal, about a potential outside review board for senior military appointments that essentially would allow the purging of senior military leaders who fell afoul of this administration without going outside the normal bounds of military promotion or review. Mm-hmm. If that kind of thing actually starts taking place and is done, you would get the entire uniformed military not resisting, but going along with it. We saw it when Eric Shinseki's delayed appointment and premature announcing of a retirement by a year was enough to cow the entire DOD into going along with the Iraq war plans, which were professional malfeasance. In the movie Animal House, there is in the final climactic scene, there's a marching band following a guy in the front, and one of the conspirators pushes aside the guy of the front and starts marching in front of the band and leads them into a cul-de-sac, and they all just keep marching because that's what marching bands do. They follow their leader. The worry I have is not that the current leadership of the U.S. Armed Services or intelligence community would be suborned or would truckle. They're extraordinarily professionalized, high-level people, and we've seen that in the previous administration. But what I would look for is if the new administration is able to punish its internal foes by deposing them and thereby gain control of the top levers of the bureaucracy, including the levers of promotion, then you would see the rest of the bureaucracies fall into line, even if they slow rolled things. Mm-hmm. And that would become the perversion of the U.S. civil service and the U.S. armed forces and the U.S. intelligence communities. I don't think we're there yet. And but I never thought you'd be, saying someone like Matt Gaetz appointed the attorney general. We still don't know what's going to happen in terms of the rest of the government and how long this will last and what will happen. There's a great deal of ruin in a nation, but those are the things I would look for, the politicization. It's not the policies at this point. We can survive bad policies if the institutions of the U.S. government are fundamentally betrayed from the top and suborned. That's when we're in deep, deep trouble.
Yeah, I mean,
Can I ask you just for clarification? Sorry, just Gideon, just like if say this, what you're describing is happening, like removing top military appointees, so forth. Can they sue this, or is this sort of purely bureaucratic? Because
they can sue. But first of all, who would they sue to? The Supreme Court, which has had the president.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm saying.
Attorney General, who is that? Look, the judiciary is a good example. You're worried about the judiciary. So am I. I'm not worried about the military unless they can actually sort of, fire the senior leadership, because the junior leadership won't result. They're not going to be a junior office. This is not a third world country in which junior officers or colonels will take over the top, but it's one in which everybody will follow along because they're professionals and or leave if they're not. And so once that happens, you're really in deep trouble.
I mean, one thing to look for in the shortest term is this talk of recess appointments, which would basically bypass the Senate approving some of these nominees. I think that is the real, feather in the wind that we should be watching right now, because I think Trump is putting that out there to flex his muscles to see what he can get away with. I think it's possible that one of
will he be a weak strongman?
That's the optimistic scenario. I think at this point, he does face a lot of the same kinds of constraints But you can cause a lot of damage in a not, granted, bureaucracies are take a long time to unravel, and but in the short run, bad policies can still have bad effects, and the precedents that get created by a president that's able to do recess appointments for his whole cabinet, which is one kind of, hopefully extreme scenario that is really just being put out there as a trial balloon to see how people respond. Because if that were to happen, then you really don't have three branches of government separate and equal. You really have executized aggrandizement on a scale that would make me very nervous, particularly given as somebody who studies democratic backsliding, you want to put weak figures in the power ministries, in the security services, so that they'll do your bidding and they won't cause you problems. So the lack of experience is not a bug, but a feature of why I think Trump is moving in this direction. I don't know that Tulsi Gabbard as the director of national intelligence is going to persuade him of much. I think it's hard to persuade Mr. Trump of anything, particularly where he thinks he knows something. But he does know that given her, lack of institutional ties and her isolation in the broader political system, that she's not going to cause him any trouble.
Okay. By the way, another box to check in terms of worries about Orbanism. If they start messing with government statistics,
that's
numbers, that's a big one, because they could hide failures and costs and react and negative consequences through the misuse of stuff. So, like, for me, even though it was comical, one of the scariest moments in the first term was that the Sharpie on the hurricane map. To not because it was significant about where the hurricane went, because it meant that it was a worry about what could be done if you just left all truth behind. And if that starts to happen, like on the economic front, the very fact that we're talking about this stuff is so mind-boggling to me. I should assure the viewers of this. We're not saying all this will happen. No, neither of us can believe it would actually happen, even as it were happening. We're just saying that this is what has happened elsewhere. These are things that have been said they want to happen here, and you don't know whether it's bluster or whether it's not, and until we actually see things play out. And then we don't know, even when it's not, if it's not bluster, what the reaction will be, what the things are. So we're not trying not to be alarmist, and we're not being political. We're just literally doing our jobs as scholars. By the way, am I right about this, guys? You guys are deeply serious professionals. We're not. This is not a political judgment here. This is just our analytical professionalism at work. Correct?
I think it's fair to say we have our views, right? I mean, I'm not gonna say that I'm neutral, whether it's democracy here or autocracy. I think democracy is better than autocracy, but we are sort of, in so the capacity as an analyst, we can say these things, would be the things to look for given how this transpired in other countries, right? And these things would be warning signs. And then somebody in the audience might say, great, let's hope it happens. And somebody would say, oh my God, let's hope it not happens. I'm going to be in the camp with those who say, oh my God, I hope it not happens. But I think the causal story there is an analytical story and not some sort of political or normative story.
Yeah, so here's two points. One is, no country with the US's history of democracy and its level of wealth has had the kind of democratic backsliding that I was talking about, right? At the same time, it's hard to think of countries where a racial majority was able to transition to becoming a demographic minority and retain its democratic credentials. How is that for
I would say that was I would have bought that analysis a little more a couple of weeks ago when the margin of victory turned out to be not the Democrats have gotten a declining share of the white vote each of the last several elections. So however much angry whites are to blame for much of this problem, they're not the ones whose views have changed and who have produced the results we've
But they
seen.
turned out at higher rates this time. That was really a key thing.
Well, I think I would put it differently. I would say others turned out at lower rates this time, and that actually, affected. Well, look, we'll be studying the outcomes. This is.
Look, we're in uncharted territory here. I study comparative politics, so I look for patterns. One thing we can say is, like, our field of political science is divided into international relations, how countries relate to each other, political theory, which is like philosophy, comparative politics, which studies mostly the internal processes of countries outside the US. And then we have this field called American politics, as if the laws of politics work differently in the United States. And one thing that I think we're seeing right now is that the U.S. is a country like a lot of other countries, and a lot of the things that we're seeing, incumbents struggling, as we've seen across the globe, the rise of social media changing the way politics is done, the weakening of parties, the rise of populism. We used to think that there was some kind of American exceptionalism, and I think that case is just much more difficult to make right now.
That is an extraordinarily depressing note. I find myself desperately searching for ways to counteract the analysis, but I find it really hard to do. And I just hope that the structural pressures that Oksana, I hope that Putin overreaches.
Yeah.
Because right now, if Putin were less obsessed, he could take a deal on very clear, on good terms. But if he holds out for even better terms, it's possible that the scenario you guys talked about might kick in and things could continue, which would not, which again, even still won't.
Right. And I think within Russia, I think they recognize that this is not a great deal for them, and there would be relief more than anything else. Maybe some of the poor regions would say, wow, we were doing so much better during the war because we were getting all these benefits. Yes, we lost a few guys along the way, but the local economy is doing really well. But those are really marginal groups. I've been studying public opinion in Russia towards the war, and roughly, in our surveys, 45% of Russians support continuing the war, about 30% oppose continuing the war, and about 20% refuse to answer or don't know. And we kind of have a sense of what they feel, that they're not willing publicly to say that they support the war, I think is important. So, I think it's really Putin is really the problem here. I'm much more of a guy who believes in structure rather than agency. But I think on Russia's war in Ukraine, the Putin factor is really hard to ignore. It's his obsession. It's more, the other Russian elite, I think, don't share this view to nearly the same degree. They're all skeptical of the West. But this is really, a Putin phenomenon that the Russian elite are not willing to do anything to stop it, certainly, and certainly not the Russian public.
To all of you in the audience, please put any questions you might have in the chat. We'll get to them, or we can turn it over to Stephen or Jenny now if you want to ask questions. But we if there's anything we haven't covered that anybody wants to cover, or any questions that still need to be asked, please let us know, and we'll find a way to ask them. Let me just see if there's anything in the chat that we haven't addressed yet.
Well, there was a question about Kursk. I don't know if you.
Yeah. So how significant is the Kursk thing?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, before I do that, I just want to say that, to echo your point, Gideon, and Tim, yours also, if Putin was less obsessed about controlling Ukraine, if we think back to 2014, not just 2022, Ukraine, yes, Euromaidan wins, but it has regional base of support. All these Russian speakers, who are sort of Russia friendly are there. Ukraine had this history of pro-Western, pro-Russian governments changing course. All of this media, oligarchs, Russia had a lot of influence in Ukraine. And in fact, it made Ukraine much more anti-Russian than it could have ever become, in the sort of normal course of things. So talking about kind of shooting ones in the foot, we can take it back even to, earlier period. But on the Kursk one, I mean, it's really interesting because it's kind of disappeared from the Western news. And how significant is it? I think at this point it is really political, because I think what Ukrainians try to do, I mean, in addition to sort of boosting morale and to show that Russia is actually not all that invincible, as I think Putin, to Tim's earlier point, was trying to portray all along, I think this whole Putin's narrative that the beginning of any negotiation has to proceed from recognizing realities on the ground, meaning like we get to keep what we seize. This makes it a much harder position to maintain if part of your own territory is insignificant as it may be. It's like villages, farmland. It's not some sort of strategic, town or whatever, is controlled, by another country. And this is why I think they have now thrown so much, like all of these North Koreans. I read earlier today a report by this Black Bird group. It's this Finnish, security experts. It's Emil, I forgot his last name. So they're like really on top of all the military stuff. And they're saying from purely military standpoint, it's completely ridiculous sort of waste of resources. But politically, it seems like Putin now is planning on to kick Ukrainians out of there before any negotiation can begin, because then he can go back to his like recognizing reality on the ground. And for that very reason, I think Ukrainians have put some experienced troops in there. Again, some criticize that military decision to hold on to it as a bargaining chip. Right. So in that sense, I would say Kursk is significant in this sort of political calculus on both sides. So that's, I think, it's kind of almost disappeared from the radar in Western media, but I don't think we have seen the last of it.
I haven't heard that analysis would put it back in, because if what you're saying is true, then unless they can eliminate that salient, any kind of deal, Ukraine would have a veto over any kind of deal, because it wouldn't just be a ceasefire in place. They'd have to withdraw.
That seems how he's interpreting it. That's why they've thrown some disproportionate number, of people, including all these North Koreans. I think some reports say it's like up to 50,000 of them there, specifically, in the Kursk area.
The other thing that's fascinating about the Kursk invasion is the reaction of the Russian public to it. I mean, an enemy country comes in, takes a huge swath of your territory, and Russians just shrug their shoulders. It's not like there's like a great groundswell of patriotic sentiment that we need to send the boys to the front. It's more like, how is this going to affect my ability to get the imported goods I want? Or it's for those who talk about this as an existential crisis for Russia.
Talking about red lines, right? Like Russian territory proper has been invaded, and we are yet at the nuclear war.
By the way, this kind of thing makes me more sympathetic when I've talked to the students about constructivism, because here the U.S. is getting all head up and deciding an election based on a fake invasion of its territory, which is a metaphorical invasion, and the Russian public isn't getting upset about an actual invasion. So clearly, the categories are indeed socially constructed and psychological as much as actual or objective.
Well, it's also true for like the NATO expansion argument, because Russia has moved troops away from the Finnish border into Ukraine, even though Finland joined NATO. So, if this was really driven by a concern that NATO was going to encircle Russia, we would see Russia behaving in a very different way. The rhetoric is very different than the behavior, and that's what we should be paying attention to.
Okay, one last question I see here. Is it possible that the North Korean, you mentioned this, Oksana, and I'm kind of curious because I hadn't thought about it as a real possibility. Will the North Korean involvement lead South Korea to give Ukraine vastly more weapons?
Yeah, I mean, I have no expertise on that region, but I would mention, actually, it was a recent poll. I can't remember where I saw it in Ukrainian or in American media, that actually majority of South Koreans are against arming Ukraine. And I take it that's because they want to keep the arms for themselves, because they think they, might be next and so forth. But at the same time, I think, again, just today was reported that South Korea supplied some substantial amount of some specific types of rockets So it seems like they are, again, sort of maybe it's a more nuanced type of support, or maybe more like behind the scenes type of support. But then again, it is happening. But it's just the very sort of talking about the unbelievable moment we're in. Like this notion, if somebody, say, a year ago told us that Ukraine is going to be fighting North Korea on Russian territory, like who would have believed this, right? Like that would have seemed to be the most crazy prediction you can make. And yet here we are. In the media, in the Ukrainian internet, now it's circulating the phrase book, Ukrainian Korean phrase book, with the sentences like, lay down your weapons, your leader is lying to you, think about your family back in Korea, in the yeah, so I don't, again, I can't say that I have any expertise in the Korean, in the two Koreas, but it seems like some of the sort of South Korean factor is coming to come into play, at least with supply of those rockets.
One other word we haven't heard much tonight is Iran. This administration, among the issues it cares about deeply, supposedly, is Iran, both on its own right and because of its role in the Middle East. Is the fact that Iran will be on the other side of this. Yeah. In other words, are the people who want to be tough on Iran going to be favorable to being soft on Iran and its ally in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think there is a tension there with China as well, where you have China hawks. They seem to be shot through the Trump administration, but you also have the Elon Musk, who has deep economic ties in China, and the business wing of the Republican Party, which would like a very different point of view. So there's a number, like we often tend to look at administrations as if they're unitary actors. But and on Iran, I think that there is going to be a lot of unity about taking a much harder line towards Iran. But how that influences policy towards Russia and Ukraine, I think there could be real debates within the Trump administration about about that. Like, should they be focusing on Iran and the Iranian regime, which purportedly tried to kill Trump right before right before the election, which won't endear them to Mr. Trump, I would think. But how that influences the Trump administration's policy towards Russia and Ukraine, I think is much harder to predict.
Okay, is there anything we haven't covered? We've covered a whole lot. You guys have been great. Oksana, do you have any final thoughts?
I'm just looking at the chat. There was something else maybe there. There was some nuclear question, right? Didn't somebody ask
is
about
Ukraine going to get nukes? Like if they can't get in NATO, would that be the...
Well, again, in Ukraine, there is certainly a sense that this Budapest memorandum was a big failure, meaning that Ukraine voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons and received security assurances. And how good were those, right? Now, and sort of, I think emotionally, many people without sort of expertise on this issue would say like, yes, we should go nuclear. But once you start looking at sort of the feasibility of it, and here I would just reference work by Mariana Bujerin, who's like the authority on everything Ukraine nuclear. Her argument, and I take it probably as experts would agree, that it's not really feasible, certainly not in the short term, right? So this sort of like Ukraine has some know-how, but not everything. It's this complicated cycle. And basically to do that is just not something that would, and that was also not really a realistic option back in 1994 to hold on to the nukes, again, because of how negatively it was seen in the West, how Ukraine needed Western aid. But so we are sort of back, we need security assurances. So I think we may see the rhetoric about it, and, certainly kind of at an emotional level, at a kind of justice level, like Ukraine was failed, right? Like it gave voluntarily denuclearized, and, then it was failed by the allies, and Russia, of course, violated its obligations. But I don't think the actual nuclearization of Ukraine, at least based on, what experts are saying, is very likely.
It's funny that Mearsheimer was in favor of giving Ukraine nukes back in the day. To John's credit, it shows that he's, he follows the beat of his own drummer. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Oksana. Thank you to Jenny and to Rhoda and to Stephen Summers and to everybody at the the NFRPP. All I can say is I look forward and truly hope to having another one of these in 6 months, so that we don't have to simply do a postmortem of a terrible settlement. Because that's the worst case scenario. In this case, the best case scenario is Ukraine gets the chance to keep going, and we see what happens.
And so does the U.S.
So does the U.S.
Yeah. Let's hope we don't do postmortem for
limping
either, right?
along. Yeah. So, okay.
Thank everybody. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
We
Good
greatly
to